The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
There are artists who chase fame, and then there are artists who are consumed by it. Benny Andersson belongs to neither category entirely, and that, perhaps, is the most revealing thing about him. For decades, the world watched ABBA conquer every chart, every continent, every generation. The sequin costumes, the euphoric melodies, the four faces that became synonymous with pop perfection. But behind all of that brightness, something quietly complicated was always simmering. Something the public sensed, but could never quite name. Now, at 78 years old, Benny Andersson is finally giving that feeling a name. In a series of remarkably candid reflections, the man who built ABBA's sound from the ground up has begun confirming what many fans and observers have long suspected. The music was never just music. It was survival. It was therapy. It was the only language Benny truly trusted. And the band that appeared to have everything together was, in reality, held together by the thinnest of threads. Threads woven entirely from melody, harmony, and unspoken pain. This is not a story of scandal. It is not a story of betrayal or bitterness. It is something far more profound and far more human than that. This is the story of a man looking back at the most defining chapter of his life and finally, for the first time, telling the full, unfiltered truth about what it cost him, what it meant, and what it revealed about the fragile nature of genius. To understand Benny Andersson today, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to ABBA, not to the glittering stages of Eurovision or the sold-out arenas of the late 70s, but to a quiet Swedish childhood shaped by accordion music, church harmonies, and an almost spiritual relationship with melody. Benny did not grow up dreaming of pop stardom. He grew up dreaming of sound itself. As a boy, he was fascinated not by fame or performance, but by the architecture of music, the way a chord could shift the emotional temperature of a room, the way a melody could say something that words simply refused to. His early musical education was rooted in Swedish folk tradition and classical structure, and those foundations gave him something that no amount of commercial success could ever replicate: an instinct for emotional honesty in music. By the time he was a teenager playing with the Hepstars, one of Sweden's most popular beat groups in the 1960s, Benny had already developed a compositional voice that was distinctly his own. He was not a showman. He was a craftsman. And while the crowds came for the performances, Benny was always thinking about something deeper. The feeling underneath the song, the shadow beneath the bright major chord, the way sadness and joy could coexist in the same four bars of music. This duality became the defining fingerprint of everything he would go on to create. And when he eventually joined forces with Björn Ulvaeus, the two of them formed one of the most quietly powerful songwriting partnerships in the history of popular music. Björn brought words and narrative structure. Benny brought the emotional subtext, the harmonic richness that made simple pop songs feel inexplicably like something more. Together, they did not just write songs. They constructed emotional experiences. What Benny has come to acknowledge in his later years is that this gift was not born from happiness. It was born from a deep and lifelong struggle to connect with people, with his own emotions, with the world outside the studio. Music was not just something he loved. It was something he needed. It was the only place where he felt completely understood. When ABBA exploded onto the global stage following their Eurovision victory in 1974, the world fell in love with four people. But the truth is, the world only truly saw two of them: Agnetha Faltskog and Annie Frid Lyngstad, known to the world as Frida, were the visual and vocal heart of the group. Their voices, their beauty, their personal stories became the currency of ABBA's public image. Benny and Björn, by contrast, were consistently framed as the men behind the curtain, the businessmen, the producers, the brains. For Björn, this framing was perhaps easier to accept, but for Benny, it quietly stung in ways he struggled to articulate for a very long time. Because what the world was missing, what the cameras and the magazine covers and the fan hysteria consistently overlooked, was that Benny was not merely the man behind the curtain. He was the curtain itself. He was the stage, the the lighting, and the entire emotional atmosphere that made ABBA's music feel the way it did. Every chord progression in The Winner Takes It All, that devastating, sweeping sensation of loss dressed up in a major key, came from Benny. Every unexpected harmonic turn in Fernando, every layered vocal arrangement in Voulez-Vous, every moment where an ABBA song seemed to shift emotional weight mid-verse, that was Benny at work. He was not programming music mechanically. He was bleeding into it quietly and invisibly, song after song after song. He has spoken in recent years about the particular loneliness of being the person in the room who feels everything most deeply but expresses none of it verbally. In the control room, behind the glass, Benny would spend entire days chasing a single feeling. Not a sound, not a technical effect, but a feeling. He wanted every track to be emotionally true, even if he himself could not have explained what that meant in a conversation. The studio was his confessional. The mixing board was his therapist. And when the accolades came, when ABBA swept award ceremonies, when Dancing Queen became an anthem that transcended generations, it was the singers who received the standing ovations. It was the singers whose faces appeared on the posters. Benny stood in the background, and while he never resented his bandmates personally, there was a growing, gnawing awareness that the world had fundamentally misread who ABBA was and where its power truly came from. Benny's relationship with Frida is one of the most quietly complex love stories in pop history. They came together not through grand romantic gestures, but through music, through late nights in the studio, through the peculiar intimacy of creating something together that neither could have created alone. Their connection was real, and for a time, it was sustaining. But it was also deeply, fundamentally complicated by the fact that Benny's emotional life existed almost entirely within music and almost nowhere outside of it. Frida was a woman of enormous emotional depth and resilience. She had survived a childhood marked by loss and instability, and she had emerged from it with a hunger for genuine human connection, for warmth, presence, reciprocity. She was not interested in metaphors. She needed the real thing. Benny, by contrast, had learned from an early age to sublimate emotion into creativity. When something hurt, he wrote. When something confused him, he composed. When a relationship between him and Frida became difficult to navigate, he channeled that difficulty into songs that would go on to move millions of people around the world. The irony is both beautiful and heartbreaking. The very pain he refused to confront directly became the raw material for some of the most emotionally resonant pop music ever recorded. Songs like One of Us and The Winner Takes It All are now understood by most people as breakup anthems. But Benny has acknowledged in his later reflections that those songs were not just expressions of heartbreak. They were his way of avoiding having the actual conversation. If he could put the feeling into a song, he did not have to put it into words. If the piano could say it, he did not have to. For Benny, this felt like honesty. For Frida, it felt like absence. He has said, with the kind of clarity that only comes with age and distance, that he gave his most honest, emotional expression to the music and not enough of it to the people in his life who needed it most. That is not a small admission. It is an enormous one. It reframes the entire emotional narrative of ABBA's golden years. Not as a story of four people working in harmony, but as a story of four people navigating profound personal struggles while trying to maintain the illusion of harmony for the world. By the late 1970s, ABBA had become something almost beyond human scale. They were not just a band. They were a global industry, a cultural institution, a brand so powerful that it reshaped the music business in ways still felt today. And for Benny, who had never sought the kind of fame and had never been particularly comfortable with the machinery of celebrity, the weight of it became increasingly difficult to carry. The touring cycles were relentless. The demand for new material was constant. The expectation that ABBA would continue producing hits, that each album would somehow surpass the last, created a pressure cooker environment that left very little room for the kind of slow, reflective, emotionally honest creative process that Benny needed in order to do his best work. He has spoken about the exact sensation of realizing, mid-career, that the music was beginning to feel manufactured rather than discovered. For Benny, writing a song had always been an act of excavation, digging down into his emotional truth and finding something genuine there. But as the commercial machine accelerated, he found himself writing not from that deep place, but from obligation, from duty, from the fear of letting everyone down. This is perhaps the least glamorous truth about ABBA's later years, and it is the one that Benny now speaks about most openly. He stayed in the band not because the creative fire was still burning, but because he felt responsible, because people depended on ABBA, not just the other three members, but hundreds of people whose livelihoods were tied to the group's continued success. Benny carried that responsibility in silence, the way he carried most things, inwardly, heavily, and without complaint. What nobody saw at the time, and what Benny is only now able to articulate clearly, is that the man producing those final ABBA albums was running on empty. The technical skill was still there. The ear was still impeccable. But the emotional honesty that had made the early work so extraordinary, that raw, searching quality that listeners could feel even without understanding it, had quietly faded. The music was still good, but it was no longer coming from the same place. When ABBA effectively ceased to function as a group in the early 1980s, there was no dramatic press conference, no public falling out, no defining moment of rupture. There was simply silence, a gradual, almost imperceptible withdrawal from a shared creative life, until one day it became clear that the life was over. For Benny, the aftermath of ABBA's end was not the relief he might have expected. Instead, it was a long, disorienting period of reckoning. The structure that had defined his adult life, the schedules, the sessions, the constant creative collaboration, the sense of shared purpose, was simply gone. And in its absence, all the feelings he had been channeling into music for more than a decade began to surface in ways he was not equipped to handle. He threw himself into new projects. Theater became his refuge. He composed the music for Chess, the internationally acclaimed musical he created with Bjorn and lyricist Tim Rice, and later poured extraordinary emotional energy into Christina Fran de Wemela, a sweeping operatic work based on Wilhelm Moberg's Emigrant novels. These were not commercial calculations. They were acts of artistic survival. Benny was rebuilding himself from the inside out, using the only tools he had ever truly trusted. What emerged from those years in the creative wilderness was a version of Benny Andersson that was in many ways more fully realized than the one who had stood in ABBA's control room. He was writing music with nobody watching. He was composing without commercial pressure, without the weight of global expectation, without the complicated emotional dynamics of four people whose personal and professional lives had become inextricably tangled. He was, for the first time in a long time, simply making music because he loved it. There's a particular kind of wisdom that only arrives after decades of experience, after the triumphs and the failures and the long, quiet years of reflection have finally settled into something resembling understanding. Benny Andersson, at 78, carries that wisdom visibly. He speaks differently than he once did, with more patience, more willingness to sit with complexity rather than resolve it too quickly. What he has been confirming in recent years, through interviews, through public conversations, through the careful and deliberate way he has chosen to engage with ABBA's legacy, is something that fans have long felt intuitively but never heard him say directly, that the music was always more than music, that the joy in the songs was real, but so was the pain underneath it. That ABBA was not a perfect pop machine staffed by happy, well-adjusted people in matching outfits. It was four deeply human beings using an extraordinary creative gift to make sense of lives that frequently felt overwhelming and difficult to navigate. He no longer feels the need to protect the myth. At this stage of his life, the truth is more valuable to him than the legend. And the truth, as he now tells it, is both more painful and more beautiful than anything the official ABBA story ever acknowledged. It is the truth that the greatest music is almost never made by people who have everything figured out. It is made by people who are searching, desperately, honestly, sometimes desperately, for something they cannot quite name. Benny also speaks now about the mentoring work he has taken on with younger Scandinavian composers, passing on not just technical knowledge, but emotional wisdom. He tells them what nobody told him, that the ability to feel deeply is not a weakness to be managed, but the very foundation of meaningful creative work. That the gap between what you feel and what you can express is not something to be feared, but something to be explored with